For those of you that I don't know, my name's Scott Dawson. I've worked for Reed for almost 4 years, and that's specialising in the recruitment of business intelligence and data professionals exclusively in that time. We like to run these events to engage with the network in a different way and provide the opportunity for some of our key contacts like Stu to get his name out there into the market. If anyone does have any questions about the market, opportunities, etc., please reach out, but I'll pass everyone over to Stu now.
Thank you very much, Scott. Much appreciated, and thanks for the introduction. We've done a couple of talks in the past together, so I'm particularly looking forward to this one. So I guess first and foremost, guys, thanks for giving up your lunch hours, basically, if you're in the middle of working. Really appreciate you joining and listening to me talk today. As a quick introduction for those who haven't met me before, my name's Stuart Wannop, and I'm a service delivery manager for a company called Differentia Consulting, who are a UK Qlik elite partner. So I work heavily in Qlik Sense, but mostly around data and analytics in general. I am, of course, a self-confessed data nerd as well. So, you know, it's something I do for a job and a little bit in my spare time as well. So that's me. So like I say, I'm really chuffed that you guys are giving me some of your time on your lunch to listen to me talk. So I hope what you'll find in the next 20 minutes or so, slightly fun and engaging, hopefully. And what I'm going to talk about, the subject really is actually quite important, especially if you work in the field of data. If working with data is your job, essentially, if you're working with data for a company, then you're what's known as a data citizen. So, you know, a data citizen is an employee who's given access to an organization's proprietary information. And, you know, the use of the word citizen is kind of meant to emphasize the idea that an employer's right to access corporate data comes with some responsibilities. So when you work with data in your job, you do have some responsibilities, you know, to report correctly and truthfully. Now, the problem we've got nowadays is that everywhere you look, there's simply more and more data freely available. And with that comes more and more opportunities to create chaos, I guess. So essentially, everybody becomes kind of a data citizen. And when you put that together with social media and all the different platforms that we have nowadays, it sets the tone in today's digital world where, well, frankly, anything goes, really. So today I'm going to kind of talk about two different things. So basically I'm going to split it up into two sections. So first I'll be talking about the differences, as was the title, between misinformation and disinformation, and how you guys can recognize these signs. And I'll follow that by showing you just a couple of ways that data can be easily manipulated to completely change the narrative. So the data doesn't necessarily need to be incorrect. It just needs to be written in a different narrative to persuade somebody to think a certain way. So in order to first talk about how misinformation and disinformation can spread, I can't really think of a better subject than something that's been on the fringes of the news a lot in 2020. And no, that's not coronavirus. I'm going to give you a break from that today. We're not going to not even mention it once. Let's just try and step out of that bubble for a moment. So I'm going to talk about misinformation, disinformation. I'm going to use the example of a movement which you may have heard about. That movement, if you haven't read the news, is called QAnon, who have basically moved from an online conspiracy to almost a global movement, really. Now, if you haven't been following the exploits of these people or organization, whatever you want to call them, QAnon began life mostly as a joke or a prank on extreme message boards in 2017. Basically, it's an unfounded conspiracy theory that claims President Trump is secretly battling a clandestine network of Satan worshipping elites who run a child trafficking ring. The Q in QAnon is actually the person or persons writing these cryptic messages on these boards to the movement's followers. And Q claims to have top secret clearance within the US government. And Q has told his followers to trust the plan for a great awakening, quote unquote. So the messages have, you know, predicted that there's going to be mass arrests and purges of top Democratic Party officials. Of course, none of this has actually come true yet. So, you know, despite its bizarre premises, it started out in niche online communities in 2017 and rapidly grew on social networks. And initially, it didn't really seem to have an agenda. It just spread. Now, it started to gain massive popularity as COVID-19 started to take hold this year, probably because a lot of more people were spending time online. And in another swirling mass of pseudoscience, there were also claims that coronavirus doesn't exist, or it isn't fatal, or any number of other baseless claims. And these two ideas basically increasingly came together in a big grand conspiracy mashup. Now, that's all well and good because it's baseless, it's on chat rooms, etc., etc. But at the end of September, President Donald Trump started retweeting and highlighting several accounts, several Twitter accounts with a history of posting QAnon content. He stoked conspiracy theories that originated in the QAnon world, even to the detriment of his own supporters sometimes. And along with other Republicans, he's increasingly accepted QAnon into the arms of the Make America Great Again, the MAGA movement, which is, again, another group, if you could call them that. So QAnon up until then had been dismissed as fringe nonsense. So ultimately what's happened in 2020, the perfect storm of misinformation started to gather pace. QAnon had just gone from the fringe to become a pro-Trump movement. And that's proved in some of the, the recent kind of pictures you'll see at the Trump rallies, where people are actually seen to be displaying QAnon signs. They call it the Great Awakening, the storm is here. It's become very much associated with the Democrat movement. So that actually prompted, ultimately, Facebook to close down a lot of QAnon accounts online, because it was said to have actually started to be influencing the outcome of the recent US presidential election. So that's kind of the brief background of how QAnon went from that fringe into kind of mainstream media and started having some influence. And that's where we come back together on how we explain the differences between misinformation and disinformation. Now, when you make this distinction, you need to keep one very important word in mind: intent. So both words refer to types of wrong or false information, but only disinformation is wrong on purpose. So while this distinction may seem pretty simple enough, misinformation and disinformation are very, very similar, and they're sometimes interconnected, and they get used interchangeably. So that's really why I use QAnon as an example. It went from nonsense, baseless, with no real intent, to something that was genuinely trying to influence the outcome of an election. So when you use the word disinformation, when you know a fact that is false or erroneous information is being spread on purpose, you use disinformation when you think that purpose is to hurt or damage, especially a government, organisation, or a public figure. If you don't know for certain why someone's spreading bad information, it's best to use misinformation. So all this stuff you see on your Twitter feeds or your social media accounts or in, strange online publications, you've got to kind of take a look and think, is there an intent there? What is the author actually trying to prove? If it seems baseless, it's misinformation. If there is an intent there, why they're doing it, then it's disinformation. So with that in mind, here's the important bit. So whether misinformation or disinformation, the data is not always wrong. Okay, so misinformation, disinformation doesn't necessarily mean incorrect data. The data is just being manipulated to fit another truth. Okay, so it is possible using the same data set to create an entirely different narrative based on a given agenda. So what I'm going to do next is just show you three kind of broad ways in which this is done. So, when you work in your, in your companies, in your data jobs, it's important that you're as truthful as possible when you present this data. So, in other words, data can tell any story that you want. So, as QAnon demonstrate regularly, all you need to do is make up a story and make it fit, and then you press the button, and then you let social media do the rest. Okay, so I'm going to show you three things briefly today. I've pulled some data together. Those of you that know me know my weapon of choice in the BI world is always Qlik Sense. So I'm going to show you a little bit of Qlik Sense and geoanalytics in this. And there's three kind of concepts here in how people can deceive with data. Principle number one is to get some data, get a theory at the other end, and make the two fit. So find a correlation. And if any of you on any of the previous talks, you'll find that correlation does not necessarily equal causation. Be happy to talk about that more in another session. Principle number two is you can literally take a chart and you can just manipulate it. Charts are very pretty things, and visuals are brilliant because they allow a human to look at it, see lots of colour, and instantly get a message as to what's being told. But there are lots of different subtle ways that certain elements of charts, whether it be the axis, the colours, the titles, the sources, can be misleading. So whilst as soon as you see a bar chart, for example, you instantly look at the bar, you should also look obviously at the axis, the source, the title, etc., etc. But in this world of social media, where you might not even look at something for more than 3 seconds, a lot of people just look at the chart and don't read the rest, and that's an important thing. That makes it very easy to open it to manipulation. And the third principle is to take a data set and again create your narrative first on what you want to tell, and then instead of using all the data, you just cherry pick certain parts of the data set that suits you. So I'm going to show you quickly 3 ways on how how to do that ultimately. So if we just whiz on to the next screen. So I've pulled together a lot of data, so it'll take a few seconds to load. And using Qlik Geoanalytics, I've pulled some data from Reuters, which basically pulls down all the voting results for different counties across the USA. Some of the data is slightly incomplete because some of them still haven't finished counting, surprise, surprise. But this paints a picture. Now, the story goes, and again, I don't know this to be fact, but I've heard that Donald Trump in the White House has a framed picture in one of the corridors showing this. You know, and you'd think this could be from the 2016 election, which he won, but it isn't. This is 2020. This is the one that he lost. Well, it's open to debate, obviously, at the moment. And you can see a sea of red, which is Democrat, and not much blue. So on the face of it, when you just quickly look at that chart, you think, well, surely the Democrats have won this. Well, no, because it's just being shown by state and county. So Donald Trump won a lot more states and counties. But as we probably know if we've watched the news, Biden won the Democrats won the popular vote. So even if you look at the full picture of the US, you can drill down a little bit and perhaps pick a state. Pennsylvania was in the news quite a lot recently, so we make that a selection, and the story remains the same. There's a lot of red Democrats there and not much blue Republicans. So that is why kind of you can paint a story that is blatantly not true just by picking out some data that you think is relevant. So if we reset those selections and think about that chart again as it goes back to the top, we now load up the second screen, which is exactly the same data, bear in mind again, but this is the number of people voting throughout the US. And remember, red's the Democrats and blue's the Republican. And this tells you a completely different story now. So you can see, where the population centers are in the US. But when you instantly look at that chart, well, you think, well, that's all Democrat. Well, of course, Joe Biden won. But what you've seen is just 2 massively contradicting stories, just based on presenting the data only in a slightly different way. So, for example, we can drop into Pennsylvania again. We'll just take a look at that state. And we zoom in. And you can see what's going on there as well. So we've got some small red dots on here, but mostly in the big cities, you've got Pittsburgh and you've got Philadelphia there. It was all voting Democrats. So again, when you see the people that vote, you can tell who wins. And when you just see it by county, you can see that, it's all red ultimately. So put that into context and, how that kind of did the rounds on social media. This particular tweet, I've hidden the name, got quite a lot of traction on social media recently. So, 250,000 likes and 100,000 shares. It's the stuff that we can only dream of, isn't it? And what he did is he created a visualization very similar to the one that I've just shown you there that I created. And his quote was, land doesn't vote, people do. And he's shown exactly the same 2 screens that I've just shown you there. So we've got the big red Democrats there, but then we've got the people voting, and that's all, sorry, the big red Republicans. And then we've got the blue Democrats on the right-hand side with all the people voting. So this is where people started to try and make things fit. So one of the replies on that Twitter thread, which got all those likes and all those comments, was, you should also probably include this visualization as well. So what somebody had actually put is they'd put their own counter visualizations to fit. And they said, this is the map where illegal immigrants live perfectly, and it overlaps the blue counties where the Democrats vote. So in other words, this guy's saying there's a perfect correlation here between where illegal immigrants live, where that data's come from, I don't know, and the voting of Democrat in the presidential election, because there was a story running on, I think, CNN and Fox that basically said a lot of these votes that the Democrats were getting were illegal because the people that were voting weren't registered voters. So guess what? This guy's put 2 and 2 together and gone, okay, that's what's actually happening there. So this prompted a whole Twitter thread that went on and on and on for quite a bit, but I picked out a couple of interesting ones. This guy said, well, you should probably include this if you're presenting that. And then somebody, probably a Democrat, came back and said, well, actually, yeah, you could probably also correlate presidential votes for the Democrats with McDonald's location in the USA. You've got a perfect correlation. In fact, you could also say the same about Domino's restaurants throughout the USA. We've got a great correlation there. And remember, correlation doesn't equal causation. But this was what he was trying to prove. And then the third one, you could also say, well, actually, Democrats must be a big fan of Bigfoot because Bigfoot report locations also correlate to voting of the blue Democrat voters. And this is how that misinformation actually spreads. People do believe this because they're getting two things and they're just making it fit. And that's, you know, that's essentially what people do to try and find a pattern in between the two. But we know that sightings of Bigfoot don't correlate to Democrat voters, right? Well, there are some people that, you know, that says it does. So that's kind of maps and charts. Maps and charts is a very easy one to find correlations because usually on maps and charts you can have population centres, and usually where there's population centres, something's happening there. But there's very rarely a cause behind that correlation. It just happens. It's because where people live ultimately. Number two principle is manipulating a chart. Yes, I do follow Donald Trump on Twitter, by the way, purely out of entertainment factors. But you know, he's been tweeting a lot. Florida was one of the key battleground states, which ultimately he won comfortably. But in these charts, we can actually see how we can manipulate a lead to make it look bigger or make it look smaller. So we've got the total Republican votes in the, in Florida, and the total Democrat votes in Florida. Massive win for Donald Trump, right? Well, it was a reasonable win, but it wasn't massive. This makes it look like a landslide. And the way we do that when we're doing charts is you can use a couple of tricks of the trade and you can manipulate different charts. So there's two forms on what you want to do. Now, let's just say the top chart is something that a Democrat will produce and the bottom chart is something that the Republicans would choose, because what we're actually doing here is we're producing a chart, now a simple bar chart, that shows the total votes that is known as diminishing a lead. Now, all we're doing there is we're creating an axis that starts at 0. And not only that, what we're actually doing here is we're expanding the axis to give us more space than we'll ever need when we're presenting this information. So what that means is that we can happily title this chart that voting results show Florida still to be a swing state. It's a close run thing, right? Yeah, so that's them diminishing an actual lead that was there. But on the bottom half of the screen, what we can actually see here is we are exaggerating the lead. So in other words, we are zooming in on just the top part of the charts, and we're also changing the baseline. So we're not starting from 0 on this axis. This is the same data set, remember, it's the same chart, and all I did was change a few numbers. We're starting the axis here at 5 million, and then we're ending it at 5.5 million. So what we're actually seeing here is a smaller cross section, which makes it look like a big win. So I can happily title this chart, Biden loses big in Florida, because on the face of it, yeah, he has. Now the reality is, it's somewhere in the middle. So if you're creating a chart and you're looking at these axes and you need to be completely kind of neutral about it, then you choose something in the middle. You might want to start the axis at 2 million and then you might want to finish it at 6 million, just so it looks somewhere kind of sensible. And another little trick when you're trying to exaggerate a lead is, and this is quite deliberate and sneaky, is that when you've got your chart along the bottom going from I've started at 5 million, but you'll also know I've ended it at 5.5 million when the grand total was 5.67 votes, 5.67 million. That's a deliberate ploy to make the lead look even bigger, because that is literally, and I quote, off the charts, because the chart isn't big enough. But I've made it small enough so it looks like it's a bigger lead. And that's how, that's how easy it is to do when you're manipulating axes. So, you need to think, when you're looking at bar charts especially, you need to think very carefully about the anatomy of a chart. Think about your axis, think about your title, you know, and think about, you know, the narrative that you're actually going to tell when you're building those visuals, because like you say, you can tell them two very, very, very different stories. And finally, we're going to look at cherry picking data. Now, cherry picking data is looking at one data set and again, deciding on your story and picking out certain elements of it. So we're looking at the same data set here again, and we've got two pie charts that I've produced here. One is showing total votes by party, and the other one is showing victories by county. Now, we all know, we think the unofficial result of the election was basically a Biden win with almost 52% of the votes. The data wasn't quite complete when I brought this down, but it's there or thereabouts. And the Republicans with 48.2% of the votes. So a slight win in total votes here. But then you look at victories by county, and on the face of it, you'd think, well, the Republicans have absolutely, you know, smashed the election here. They've won nearly 2/3 of all counties and voting centres in America, with the Democrats only getting 1/3. And this can go on in any different state ultimately. So, you know, if we pick, for example, we'll try Pennsylvania again, because again, that was in the news a lot. And we can see, yeah, it was a close run thing, was Pennsylvania. So we, you know, the Democrats won just over 50% and the Republicans just below 50%. But then you might present it this way, and you can look on the surface of it and think, well, you know, the Republicans have absolutely hammered this here because it's being run by county. So what I'm doing there is deliberately picking certain parts of the data that might look favourable to what my agenda is. So any state can be picked here. We can pick Illinois is probably a good example if I take that off, because that tells you two opposite ends of the story here in terms of total votes. You can see you're getting on for nearly 2/3 of Democratic votes in Illinois, but if you look at the states, then, well, sorry, if you look at the counties, you can see the Republicans are like 85% and the Democrats only got 1. So Illinois is a classic one because you've effectively pretty much got Chicago. If you win Chicago, then you win the election in that particular state and you get all the college votes. So when you look at the final result, though, both total votes by party and victories by county, if any of you know anything about the election process, none of those metrics actually guarantee victory for either president, because it's based on college votes in the state. So both of these charts in themselves, if you're trying to predict who wins the election or who wins the state, are completely misleading. So you would count the number of college votes in there anyway. So yeah, so that chart can be anything that you want it to be, and you cherry pick different parts of the data. So ultimately, what this actually means is that when you're working in data, you know, you have to try and tell the story that is unbiased, without emotion. And to do that, when you're building your charts and your visuals, you've got to look at it. You've got to be very, very careful about the titles you give to your charts, the subtitles you give to your charts, the axis that you use, the type of chart that you use, and also even things down to the colors and things that could all actually have an impact. So it's not just a case of producing a bar chart and saying, there you go. It's easy to build one of those without explaining it and then publish it, and people will interpret it how they want. As data citizens, really, you need to be looking at that anatomy of the chart and those different aspects and paying careful attention to each one of them. And only then can you know, tell the truth. And once we've got the truth out there, then only then can people make better decisions. And, you know, and that works out in the public domain, and also works within your organizations as well. So that kind of concludes what I wanted to say about the information and the disinformation. And like I say, if you're working in data, then it's a really important subject and one of the crucial kind of cornerstones to data literacy, because as I said right at the beginning, there's so much kind of, you know, lies and untruth out there and manipulated data that it's becoming very, very confusing out there. And if you work in data, you know, it's up to you guys to, you know, to talk about this, to talk to your friends about it, because Some people only look at a chart or a visual or some data for 3 seconds and they draw a conclusion. And that's how the likes of movements like QAnon get out there and spread on social media. And that's why you get these movements. So yeah, that's it for today for this session. So again, do thanks Scott for inviting me on to talk, and I hope you've enjoyed it on your lunch times. And if there are any questions, I'm going to briefly pass you back over to Scott. Yeah, Scott.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, Stuart. It was really interesting. Unfortunately, the Q&A function doesn't seem to be working, which is really annoying. So what I've done is I've shared the screen with both our email addresses. So if anybody would like to kind of discuss anything in a little bit more detail, by all means, reach out to me, reach out to Stu, and we'll be more than happy just to kind of arrange a call. And we can discuss any of the concepts that Stu went through. And yeah, we'll absolutely get something else in the diary. I think, Stu, if you're up for it, if you're up for kind of round 3, let's get something else in the diary. And
yeah, 100%. I mean, there's always a lot of data out there, Scott, and I really like talking to other data professionals about it as well, and how we can help. So I'm more than happy if you to drop me an email to talk. I'm also on LinkedIn as well, and on Twitter, QlikStew75 I think is my handle. But do reach out on LinkedIn to either myself or Scott, or drop us an email and we can talk further. And yeah.
Fantastic. So I'll end the event now and hope to speak to you all soon. And see you later, Stu.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Have a good day.